Read this sentence and notice what just happened. Some part of you said it, not out loud, no air moved through your throat, but something in your head produced these words in something close to your own voice, arriving in your mind at almost exactly the pace your eyes moved across the page. You didn't choose to do that. It simply happened, the way it happens dozens of times a minute, every waking hour, for essentially your entire life. Now ask a harder question. Did a human being living 40,000 years ago experience that same thing? Was there a voice in a Neanderthal's head? Did someone standing on the African savanna 200,000 years ago hear themselves think in words, the way you're hearing yourself read this sentence right now? It sounds like a strange thing to wonder about, because the inner voice feels like the most basic, most permanent fact of being a person. But the honest answer is considerably stranger and considerably less settled than most people assume, and it runs through child psychology, fossilized throat bones, a deeply controversial book from 1976, and the outer edges of what neuroscience is actually able to prove about a mind it cannot directly observe. Let's start with what your inner voice actually is, because that turns out to matter enormously for figuring out how old it might be. Researchers who study this call it inner speech, and it is not simply ordinary talking with the volume switched off. When you speak out loud to another person, you have to build a complete, grammatically legal sentence, because it has to survive the trip out of your mouth and into somebody else's understanding. Inside your own head, none of that labor is necessary. Inner speech is heavily compressed. A fully formed thought, as I should really leave now because traffic is going to get worse, can collapse down into a single flash of the word now, paired with a feeling of urgency and a mental image of a road, and that's the entire thought, complete and functional, without ever assembling into a real sentence at all. At other moments, usually during difficult reasoning or emotional conflict, the voice expands back out into something closer to full dialogue. One part of the mind asking a question, another part answering it, a third part showing up late with a criticism and no useful suggestion. That structure, a voice built from more than one internal position, is actually the first real clue about where this ability comes from, and it points towards something almost nobody expects. Inner speech appears to be built out of social experience, not generated in isolation. Watch a young child working on a task, and you'll frequently hear them narrating themselves out loud. This piece goes here, not that one. They are not confused about who's listening. Talking to themselves helps them organize and control what they're doing. The dominant developmental theory, building on the work of Soviet psychologist Lev Vygotsky in the 1930s, is that this out-loud private speech gradually moves inward as children grow. Instructions once spoken by parents and caregivers become instructions that a child can eventually give to themselves silently. The outside voice doesn't disappear. It becomes internal software that the developing mind can run privately. If this theory is right, and there's real developmental evidence supporting it, then the specific verbal inner monologue most adults experience isn't something you're simply born with, fully installed. It's something built, individually, inside every single human being who acquires language, using the raw material of the actual people who talked to that specific child. Which raises the obvious next question. If your particular inner voice had to be built during your own childhood, using the language and speech patterns available to you, did the very first humans capable of building one actually have the raw materials to build it with? And that pulls this whole question out of psychology and straight into the fossil record. The hyoid is a small, delicate, horseshoe-shaped bone that sits in your throat, unconnected to any other bone in your body, anchoring your tongue and supporting your larynx. It's essentially the only part of the entire vocal tract capable of surviving as a fossil, which makes it one of the very few physical clues we have about when the anatomy for complex spoken language actually existed. In 1989, researchers led by Baruch Arensberg discovered a remarkably well-preserved hyoid bone at Kibara Cave in Israel, belonging to a Neanderthal who lived roughly 60,000 years ago. Its shape was almost indistinguishable from a modern human hyoid. A more detailed 2013 study, using CT scanning to examine the bone's internal structure rather than just its outer shape, confirmed that the Kibara hyoid didn't just look like a modern human's. It appears to have functioned mechanically in a strikingly similar way, and the anatomical trail goes back considerably further than that. Similar hyoid bones recovered from Cima de los Huesos in Spain, belonging to Homo heidelbergensis, an ancestor shared by both Neanderthals and modern humans, suggest that this modern-style vocal anatomy had already emerged by roughly 530,000 years ago and stayed largely unchanged from that point forward. That's a genuinely significant number. It means the physical hardware capable of supporting complex spoken language, and by extension, the internal, silent version of that same language, may have existed in our lineage for over 500,000 years. Whether that hardware was actually being used for anything resembling inner speech, of course, is a completely different question, one bones alone cannot answer. Anatomy tells you what a body was capable of. It says absolutely nothing about what was actually happening inside that person's head. Which brings us to the most genuinely strange and most genuinely contested chapter in this entire story. In 1976, a Princeton psychologist named Julian Jaynes published a book called The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, and its central claim is, even by the standards of academic psychology, extraordinary. Jaynes argued that ancient humans, up until roughly 3,000 years ago, did not experience introspective self-aware consciousness at all, at least not in the way we understand that term today. Instead, he proposed that the brain operated in what he called a bicameral, or two-chambered state, in which one hemisphere generated commands, experienced by the person as an audible voice, while the other hemisphere simply obeyed. Crucially, Jaynes argued that people in this state didn't experience that voice as their own inner thought. They experienced it as an external command, the voice of a god, an ancestor, or a king, speaking directly into their mind and telling them exactly what to do next. Jaynes built much of his case on close readings of ancient literature, most famously the Iliad, one of the oldest surviving texts in Western literature, where characters constantly hear God speaking directly to them at moments of crisis, urging them into specific actions, rather than appearing to reason the decision through on their own. Jaynes pointed out that Homeric Greek genuinely lacks much of the vocabulary we'd now consider essential to describing an inner mental life. No clean, consistent word for something like a soul or a unified self making private decisions. He argued that this reflected something real about how the people composing and reciting these stories actually experienced their own minds, and that the eventual breakdown of this bicameral state, driven by the pressures of increasingly complex societies, trade, and literacy, forced humans to develop the interior, self-narrating consciousness most of us now simply take for granted. Here's what has to be said plainly. This theory is not mainstream neuroscience, and never has been. It was controversial on publication and remains controversial now, nearly 5 decades later. Critics have pointed out, reasonably, that reading a lack of introspective vocabulary in ancient poetry as proof of a genuinely different neurological state is an enormous leap, since poetic convention, oral storytelling tradition, and the practical demands of a memorized epic could just as easily explain why gods are shown speaking rather than characters quietly reasoning to themselves on the page. There is no direct neurological evidence that any human brain in the last several 100,000 years operated with functionally separated hemispheres in the specific way Jaynes described. Most working cognitive scientists and neuroscientists today treat the bicameral mind hypothesis as speculative at best and largely rejected at worst. And yet the book has remained stubbornly, genuinely influential, not because mainstream psychology accepted its central claim, but because it asked a question almost nobody else was asking seriously. Not whether ancient humans were capable of language, which the fossil and archaeological evidence strongly supports, but whether the specific, private, first-person experience of hearing yourself think is itself something that had to be culturally built. The same way a child today has to build their own inner monologue out of the language spoken around them. Jaynes may well have gotten the mechanism, the neuroscience, and the timeline dramatically wrong, but the underlying question he was chasing, whether consciousness as we experience it has a history rather than simply always existing in its current form, remains a genuinely live, unresolved question in the philosophy of mind. So, where does that actually leave us? Here's the honest, uncomfortable answer. We simply cannot directly test what was happening inside an ancient human's head, because subjective experience leaves no fossil. Nobody 40,000 years ago left behind a diary entry describing whether their thoughts arrived as words, images, or something else entirely. Even modern research on inner speech has real, acknowledged limits. Most of what we know comes from self-reports gathered from participants in modern, literate, heavily verbal societies, overwhelmingly from populations that are Western, educated, and used to being asked to introspect and describe their thoughts in a research setting. We already know inner experience varies enormously between people alive right now. Some people report a constant, detailed verbal monologue running through nearly every waking moment. Others, sometimes called low or absent in inner speech, report thinking primarily in images, physical sensations, or a kind of wordless, conceptual sense of meaning that resists being translated into sentences at all, a pattern researchers have recently started calling anendophasia. If inner experience is genuinely this variable across people living in the same modern culture, speaking the same language, confidently reconstructing the private inner texture of a hunter-gatherer's mind from 40,000 years ago starts to look considerably less certain than it might first appear. What we can say with real confidence is this: the physical capacity for complex spoken language, the anatomical hardware, appears to have existed in our lineage for an extraordinarily long time, plausibly over 500,000 years based on hyoid evidence stretching back to Homo heidelbergensis. Once you have complex spoken language being used socially, out loud, between people, the developmental evidence from how children build their own private inner speech today strongly suggests that some internalized version of that same language was very likely available to ancient minds as well, at least once complex grammar and vocabulary had genuinely developed within a given community, a milestone anthropologists still debate the exact timing of. Whether that internalized language felt the way yours does right now, whether it was experienced as a genuinely private first-person thought or, as Jaynes speculated, sometimes interpreted very differently by cultures whose entire framework for explaining an unbidden internal thought looked completely unlike ours, is something the available evidence simply cannot settle either way. What does seem clear, from the child development research alone, is that the specific texture of your inner voice, its exact tone, its vocabulary, whether it sounds encouraging or critical, whether it speaks in full sentences or single compressed words, is not something fixed and universal across all humans who ever lived. It is something built, individually, generation after generation, out of whatever language, culture, and relationships happened to surround the person building it. Which means the version of the inner voice you're hearing read this sentence right now, however permanent and universal it feels, is very likely not identical to whatever was happening inside the mind of someone standing beside a fire 200,000 years ago. It's a much newer, much more specific construction, built on genuinely ancient biological hardware, using cultural materials that keep quietly changing, generation after generation, right up to the one currently sitting inside your own head.